Welcome, Adam. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. Would love to have you start off by introducing yourself. Tell us who you are, what you're doing, what you're most excited about right now.
Awesome. Sure thing. And first of all, thanks a lot for having me. I'm really looking forward to and excited for this conversation. I'm an executive coach. I work with CEOs and other executives ranging at companies from growth startups to Fortune 500 to help them lead through uncertainty, change, and complexity. And I've got a background in leadership. I was CEO of a private equity backed company. I was an executive at a public company. Uh, and So I've kind of been in the leadership space for a while.
We were talking a little bit before we started hitting record how leadership and culture has changed over the last 3-5 years. How have you seen that from your times being a leader and executive in the past, both at a startup and then a public company, and then now as you're working with all of these other companies and leaders?
Yeah. So when COVID hit, I was an executive at a company, and I think we all remember how much the world changed overnight.
Yeah.
And when the world changed, companies changed too. And what was important and what wasn't important changed. And we saw a rise of companies really taking a bigger interest in their employees' well being and their employees' health. And I think that that's led to this world that we're at now, where sometimes people are remote, sometimes they're in person, sometimes they're hybrid. And it's not just enough for people to be working towards a paycheck or working towards a promotion. I think now people care about having meaning at work and enjoying work. And so things like culture and the values of a company has become even more important than it was before. As a result, leaders have needed to become a lot more intentional with how they lead so that they can show up in the way that employees need for them to show up for their teams to do their best work.
Why do you think that change happened?
Oh, well, I think collectively we all went through a really big trauma, I would say, to the human psyche, right? I think that change was really fundamental in what happened during COVID, right? There was a health crisis, of course, but it was also a really big change, and human beings aren't wired for change, right? Change is typically challenging. So for all of us collectively to go through that much change in such a short amount of time, it makes sense that the world would have kind of needed to adjust to fit around this new reality. And that new reality is a world where we know what it's like to go through difficult change. We know what it's like to go through hardship. And it opens up the question of why are we here and what are we up to and what makes a life well lived? So the old narratives of it's just about the paycheck. It's about the corporate ladder. How can we work our way up? I don't want to say it's not there, but I think it's that and this other part, which is feeling a sense of purpose, feeling a sense of meaning, feeling like what you do matters, feeling a sense of belonging with the company that you're at, with the team you work with, feeling supported by your manager. All of those things that might have been kind of there are, I think, now front and center in a much bigger way than they were before.
Yeah, my experience was that it just accelerated the integration of work into every part of our life, right? I can remember I was working at United Health Group at the time, massive Fortune 5 company. And it was like I can remember being in an all hands at kind of our little, our department. And this is like 3 weeks before the lockdowns. And somebody's like, hey, what about that? People are getting sick. What about that? And they're like, we're watching it. And then, fast forward and they're like, Minnesota I was in Minneapolis at the time, declared a state of emergency. And it was like 2 p.m. And they were like, hey, take your monitors home because we don't know when you're coming back. And it was like the whole office shut down. Everybody walked out at the same time. And it was like grocery stores were empty for a few days because everybody crashed it. And then it became, even once I went back into the office, like the work was so integrated into life, I had things on my phone before, but being kind of a younger part, it was like, great. It doesn't bother me to have more notifications. But now I think it's just become main place of you can't clock out, like work is every part of it. And it's forced people to care more about how aligned their own kind of personal values are with what the company's trying to do. Because you can't disconnect from it anymore. It's become more of a core part of your identity. And I think that has been evident in everything you're saying, right? In all of the things that we're caring about more now than we did before.
Yeah, it certainly has become a lot more difficult, as you're saying, for people to delineate the boundary between working and not working. So the time that we spend at work, right? If we're spending 40 hours a week or 50 hours a week or 60 hours a week putting in work, it's kind of like, am I doing something that I want to be doing? How do I feel about that work that I'm doing?
So you work with a lot of leaders now. How many of them have adapted to that well versus people who are stuck 5 years ago?
It's interesting. It's sort of a mixed bag. I think that there are some leaders who are, kind of holding on to the old way of working, and those leaders get frustrated because they'll say things like, my team isn't working the number of hours that I expect them to. And we'll try to change that behavior by coming in and saying, you're not working enough hours. You need to work more hours, which is really not meeting other individuals where they're at. I mean, there are ways to motivate people to work harder, but it's not by asserting that they're coming in with the wrong approach, the wrong frame. Now, back in the day, that used to work because it was standard for people to work at the same company for long periods of time. And integrated into our cultural narrative was, if you're at a company, like, that's where you're going to be. So you need to do what they ask for, right? And that was how hiring worked. People expected that you had a long track record. That's not the case now. There's this phrase that I heard recently that we're moving from career ladders to career lily pads. You heard that yet?
No, I like that though.
Yeah, the idea is, like, we're not working our way up one ladder at the same company towards a specific job. Like, people are bouncing around more from lily pad to lily pad, from opportunity to opportunity. So there's a lot more fluidity. So when somebody comes in and says, I want you to work longer hours, it's really easy for somebody to say, why? Maybe I should work somewhere else. And that option is there in a much bigger way in people's minds than it used to be. All the way on the other end of the spectrum, there are leaders who really understand that things are changing and are staying adaptable, staying agile, and moving with the change. And I think that ability to understand where things are changing is so important for companies. Obviously, on the product front, right? You need to know who your customers are. If their preferences are changing, you start to change your product to fit the customer's needs. It's the same thing with employees. Like, you could think of employees as maybe your most important customer that you need to keep satisfied, right? Meaning, like, what are their needs? What do they want? How do they think about their world? What are their dreams? What are their fears? All the same types of questions you would ask about external customers, you can ask about your employees, and use that as a tool to meet them where they're at, so that you can all work towards collectively having great results at a company. I firmly believe that company needs and company goals can be better met by really understanding the psychology of the employees who work at a company, and learning, how can we get the company needs met in a way that aligns with the worldview of our employees.
Yeah, that's fascinating. As you were talking just then, I kind of made this connection that I never thought of before. Right, so I'm an entrepreneur. I've started several companies, and there's this idea where, if you target everybody, it's really hard to meet people's needs. But if you have a very clear definition of, hey, this is who we provide solutions for, and you build for that, it's much easier. And on a similar thing with, employees, if you went around to, United Health Group, 300,000 people when I was there, and you were like, hey, asking everybody, and you tried to make everybody happy, it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard. But if you can have you have a smaller group of people, and it's just easier when it's smaller to identify, okay, what are the shared values here? And then defining that and rallying around that, make it so much easier to have what you described, right? To have that kind of magical alignment. Yeah, which is just fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there are some parallels between product development and product market fit, and company value creation, and companies finding the right employees who can work at the company.
So how you work with a lot of companies, how often is it that when you show up or you get brought in or introduced to them, that they already have a really solid set of defined values?
It's both often. I mean, it happens and it doesn't happen. I think it's really tied to company maturity.
Okay.
The larger the business is, the more likely they are to have values. Obviously, your experience in corporate, there were values that were there.
Can't tell you what they were, but they were there.
So that's telling, because I've worked at companies where even now today I could tell you what the core values were because of
That's
how much
cool.
it was part of the company culture. So it's not just about having values, it's also about reinforcing values, right? So it's not just talking the talk, it's walking the walk. And how do you keep the values front and center in your systems, in your processes with respect to how you engage employees? So that's what's happening on the bigger company side. On smaller companies, the values often aren't clear, or they might be have been written down, but they're going to evolve and change over time, and that's okay. But typically, when I work with small companies, it's either they don't have it or they're in process of pulling them together, and then all the end on the other end, you've got very well clearly articulated values, and then this last piece that we're talking about is, well, great that it's articulated, but is there teeth in it, right? Is it really embedded in the organization? Do people make decisions? Do they hire based on the values? Do they reward performance based on values? Do they recognize based on values? Do they performance manage based on values? And do they fire based on values? If you can line your values up with all those systems, then it is much more front and center, and it can really become part of an organization, which of course then leads to alignment, right? Because everybody can approach their work in a similar way that can lead to stronger alignment, which leads to faster decision making, which leads to faster progress, which leads to faster growth.
So in smaller companies, when they don't have their values defined, they probably also don't have these processes defined that you're saying that the value should bleed into, right?
They may or may not. Depends how big the company is, right? Like you're a solopreneur, I assume.
No, I have a co-founder,
You have a
so
co.
there's two of us.
So there's two of you. So you guys don't really need to think about that yet. But if you had a team of, 10, 15 people, you're starting to get to a big enough size where you need to think about how are we going to hire the right people? Because you'll probably have made a couple of bad hires and you realize we can't just wing it. Like there's a process here to follow. And you probably will have gone through an experience of holding on to somebody who wasn't the right fit for too long. And so you'll know, okay, we got to do something with performance manage and understanding when it's time to let somebody go. So even with small businesses, you'll find it. Of course, it's not going to be nearly as robust as a large company. Large company might have a 30-page document on how to hire. If you're a small business, it might be you've got, 5 to 7 bullet points on a piece of
Yeah.
paper. But there's still, there's still something there. There's still a framework that you're working within.
Yeah. So when you're working with smaller companies and they're to a point where they should have their values defined and they don't, how do you help them go about that process?
Yeah. So I think that companies go through a couple of inflection points. There's sort of like when it's you or you and a co-founder, when you get to a size of 10 people, it's like, I got a team that I'm working
Yeah.
with. And when you get to 30 people, you're starting to think about, I've got a team, but I'm layering in additional levels of management and I need to think about delegation. If you don't have values defined by the time you're 30 people, like that's really the time to dig in. And I think it's a good idea to do it even if you've got, 10, 15 people to define values. The way that I like to think about it and the way that I work with my clients is to ask them, who are some of your really strong performers and what are the qualities that those strong performers exhibit? And then I'll also ask them for underperformers who you've let go, or if I'm talking to maybe a CEO and co-founder, I can say for the underperformers who might be in your organization now, if it's a closed session, like what are the things that they're doing or not doing that defines those types of people? And we'll write that down. And then we'll start to see where the patterns are. And we'll start to see like, what is it within this group of people that seems to be working? And what are the things that haven't been working? And that usually is an exercise where we can start to get signal on what the values are that that company might already be living by. And then it's just a process of codifying it and writing it down.
Okay. And so now I'm testing myself because I'm going to try to repeat the things you said in the areas, the processes that the value should bleed into. There was one before hiring, but hiring, performance management, how you fire people. What was the other
Rewarding,
one?
recognition.
Rewarding,
But actually,
recognition.
it's not just those, it's everything, right? So it's
Yeah.
also how do you run your meetings? How do you make decisions? How do you engage in conflict? If you go to two different organizations, their conflict processes or their decision-making processes are going to look really different. I've got a client who I'm working with right now where the CEO of that business specifically hires people who are very different from each other because he wants diversity of opinion. But when they make decisions, there's an intentional period of disagreement where he wants people to weigh in with very different perspectives, right? And the benefit of that is you get diversity of opinion. The con of that is it slows decision making down. But that's a decision that they've made culturally. They want to lean into creativity and they're okay if the speed slows down a little bit, right? There are other companies that focus on a single accountable owner. And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, but people can share decisions, but there's going to be one person who's going to make the decision at the end of the day. And that person gets to choose how much input they get or don't get. Great. They're going to move faster at the expense of creativity and getting different opinions, maybe even at the expense of getting people on board. That's a decision that they made because they're moving faster. They can, potentially be okay with some of the things that they're letting go of. So it's not just those 5 areas related to people. It's also really related to everything.
Everything. Yeah.
Is it's all the different types of things, how you give feedback, how you receive feedback, all of it.
So, how have you been able to see a quantifiable ROI on having alignment between your defined values and processes throughout the organization?
I'm sure that there's data out there. I can't speak to any live on this call, but
That's
what
okay.
what I'll say is that I've lived both worlds, right? I've been at a company where the values were sort of diffused and not really front and center and present, and I've experienced the lack of alignment that can happen as a result. And I've also lived at companies where, like I said, you go up to anybody in the company, you say, "What are our 5 core values?" And they would be able to answer that. And why is that? It's because every week there would be an all hands. And at the beginning of the all hands, the CEO, I'm trying to remember how this worked. I think he would point to 5 different people and have them say one of the core values,
Oh,
right?
cool.
And of the 5, they got to 5 core values. And then they were definitely doing monthly awards, one for each core value. So there were, things that they were doing to keep it top of mind.
That's awesome. Talk about a pop quiz if you're new and you don't
I
know what
know.
they are.
Especially when 4 of them have been said and you're the last one. I
I
remember
know. Yeah.
getting a little bit nervous. What's the one that hasn't been said?
Very, very few options.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Adam. This has been an awesome conversation. If people are interested to learn more about the stuff you're doing and to stay in touch with you, what's the best way?
Yeah. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. They can look me up there. My first name's Adam. My last name's Birnbaum. I'm sure it'll be in the show notes. And then you can also visit me on my website, which is www.clearpath.group.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It was great talking.